Hi, I'm Marek with the Center for European Studies at Carleton University, and I'm joined today by Dr. Petra Bendel from Erlangen-Nuremberg University in Germany. Dr. Bendel is here today to participate in a policy workshop on European Union migration policy. So thank you for joining me today, Dr. Bendel.
You're welcome.
Now, your talk really focused on the Common European Asylum System, but asylum policy has been a subject to common policy in Europe for some time now. So what's new or different about this latest initiative?
You're right. The Common European Asylum System has been tried to build up for some 15 years already, when the member states decided to avoid that what they considered the so-called asylum shopping or asylum hopping. That means asylum seekers trying to get their claims through in different member states. So the goal was to reach a common protection standard for everyone in the EU. But this goal was never reached. On the contrary, its results have rightly been criticized as a so-called protection lottery because it really makes a very big difference if you get your asylum application treated by, say, Greece or Finland, if you want to get a positive decision. So the member states used to agree only on minimum standards, on the smallest common denominator, and even when they implemented these directives or decisions into national law, they picked out what fitted best into their administrative systems, their traditions, and so on. So the result was far from common standards, but rather a rig-rag of different legislations within the EU. And this is what the relaunch of the so-called new Common European Asylum System seeks to end. It tried to harmonize legislation, it tried to raise the protection standards for refugees in all the member states, and to create a system of shared responsibility and solidarity among the member states.
In your opinion, what do you think the impact of this new approach will be for refugees seeking asylum in Europe?
Well, on the positive side, first of all, the new CAS took the line away from the previous minimum standards, and it raises protection standards for those member states which up to now had only very rudimentary systems. And it has shown a special concern for especially vulnerable persons and unaccompanied minors. It has also accelerated asylum procedures in principle, and it has opened easier access for asylum seekers to the labor market. On the other hand, it still leaves room for the member states for the detention of refugees on a number of grounds. It also maintains the possibility to proceed with lower procedures in case that a great number of persons is involved at the borders or in transit zones. And it maintains the principles of safe third countries, what you also know in Canada, showing that the member states during negotiations had a certain fear that their asylum systems might be abused. So this is at best a mixed result for the refugees, for common standards for refugees and asylum seekers in the member states.
What are the outcomes of the CEAS likely to be for European Union member states, particularly on the southern and eastern borders of the Union?
You mean the member states with external borders, of course. Yeah, they have rightly claimed for an increased solidarity among the member states within the EU, but given the decision-making process in Brussels, within the Council, where the member states try to find broad majorities, the member states in the center of the EU, particularly Germany, Austria, or France, do not show a real political will to take up more refugees than they already have, or to discuss criteria for the relocation or redistribution of refugees among the member states. So solidarity mechanisms really, even after the catastrophe of Lampedusa in October 2013, that happened on the Italian island remained on a very low level because member states cannot agree on new criteria for relocation and redistribution. Although I feel that there has to be some fresh debate on relocation and also on resettlement in the EU if you want to take the common system seriously.
Do you see any sort of changes, maybe a less restrictive attitude toward asylum seekers from certain member states, given or as a result of the difficulties that countries like Greece and like Italy have had in handling very large flows of asylum seekers?
Well, no, I'm afraid not really. We did have a certain important jurisprudence on case law, which make it easier for refugees to access territory of the member states in the EU. But during the negotiations of the Common European Asylum System, when it came to protection standards, the member states normally pointed out their deeply rooted fear of a possible abuse of their asylum systems, of creating even more pull factors for people to come. In that attitude, they normally agree. I would rather make out a difference between the EU institutions, not so much among the member states. During the negotiations on the relaunch of the CAS, it was the Commission and the European Parliament who defended a broader immigration concept, who insisted on elevating the protection standards, on clinging to human rights standards and refugees' rights, and to harmonize legislation, whereas the Council, where the member states are represented, did not. And this can also be observed at the moment when the Program for Justice and Home Affairs for the next 5 years, the so-called post-Stockholm program, is debated. Also here, the member states insist on policy instruments that foster border security, that confront irregular migration, whereas the European Parliament regards this tendency very critically. Nevertheless, the new program has to be developed under the Greek and Italian presidency, and it remains to be seen whether these member states can successfully insist on more solidarity among the member states and less on security issues, maybe.
What are the differences or maybe the similarities between Europe and Canada when it comes to migration and asylum policy?
Well, in immigration issues in general, Canada, of course, has a very important level of permanent economic immigration, which makes it a lot more prepared maybe to confront or address demographic challenges in the future than the EU has. The EU has still not managed to do that, nor does it really have the competence to legislate on labor immigration, for instance. And with regard to refugee policies, I think Canada and the EU do show a common tendency to restrict access to their territories with a certain concern for international rights, such as the principle of non-refoulement, of course, with one of the biggest refugee crises of recent times in Syria. For instance, it is of utmost importance, I think, to keep the borders open to those in need of protection. And this is something I don't see in both areas. And here is an important difference between Canada and the EU also to be found, which is resettlement. I think that we might learn a lot from the resettlement program in Canada. Canada is certainly resettling a very high number of refugees, whereas in Europe this system is really incumbent, supported by the United Nations High Commission on Refugees. It's only just beginning, and it is not yet coordinated at the EU level. It's still voluntary, completely voluntary, and this might be a case for policy learning from Canada for the EU.
Canadian policymakers in recent years have been looking to Europe for new and often more restrictive approaches to migration and asylum policy. So I was just wondering if I could get your opinion on these recent trends in Canadian policymaking.
I think that really we can learn a lot from each other. But in that policy learning, it remains to be clear about the goals really behind all these measures. And this is about international law, really. When it comes to refugee protection, there are serious concerns about the fulfillment of standards and norms, which are not only humanitarian considerations of some kind, but which are really international rights to be claimed. And one of them is the right to claim asylum and to claim it individually and not as a group. And the other one is the principle of non-refoulement, clearly stated in the Geneva Refugee Convention. And when it comes to exporting policies from one side of the Atlantic Ocean to another, I think border securities or principles like safe third countries, which may undermine these principles, I think we should remind our countries, both the EU member states and the EU itself and Canada, to cling to these principles.